I sat with the files piling faster than I could name them, the system demanding speed, not meaning. The orders were clear, and still the names kept returning where they should not have been. I followed procedure, knowing each stamp closed a door I would never see reopen. Somewhere in the margins I understood what had slipped past me, and I said nothing. By the summer of 1941, metropolitan France had been divided for nearly a year. Following the armistice of June 40, the country existed under an uneasy dual system. Northern and western regions were occupied directly by German forces, while the southern zone, officially unoccupied, was administered by the French state headquartered in the spa town of Vichy. Though nominally sovereign, this government operated under strict constraints imposed by the German Armistice Commission and by its own commitment to collaboration, particularly in matters of internal security. Vichy France maintained a complex bureaucratic apparatus inherited from the Third Republic. Ministries continued to function, prefectures issued circulars, and police files accumulated at a steady pace. This machinery was tasked with preserving order, monitoring political dissidents, and demonstrating to German authorities that France could manage its own population without direct intervention. Surveillance of communists, former Popular Front activists, foreign refugees, and suspected anti-national elements intensified as the regime sought to prove its reliability. In the regional capital of Clermont-Ferrand, one such administrative node operated with little distinction from pre-war routines. Offices were understaffed, paper supplies were limited, and many experienced civil servants had been demobilized, dismissed, or reassigned. Those who remained worked long hours cataloguing reports from rural gendarmerie posts, municipal police, and informants. The work was procedural and repetitive, involving classification codes, carbon copies, and rubber stamps that marked each document's bureaucratic fate. Among the clerical staff assigned to the regional police archive was a mid-level functionary in his late 30s, a former records officer who had entered public service in the 1920s. His position was neither prominent nor influential. He held no policy-making authority and rarely interacted with senior officials. His responsibilities involved indexing incoming reports, ensuring that summaries were forwarded to the appropriate desks, and filing originals according to prescribed categories. The role demanded accuracy, discretion, and adherence to protocol. The reports passing through his hands reflected the growing strain beneath the surface of the Vichy state. Though open resistance remained limited in 1941, small signs of non-compliance were beginning to appear. Gendarmes noted the disappearance of ration cards, the circulation of handwritten leaflets, and the movement of individuals without proper authorization papers. Most incidents were minor, often dismissed as black market activity or administrative confusion rather than organized opposition. The French police system categorized threats according to established typologies. Political agitation fell under one classification, espionage under another, and simple criminality under a third. The distinction mattered, as political files were shared more readily with German liaison officers, while local infractions could be handled internally. Errors in classification were not uncommon, especially when reports arrived incomplete or were written by junior officers unfamiliar with updated directives. In late August 1941, a routine dispatch arrived from a small town in the Haute-Loire department. The report described a brief detention of two men stopped during a nighttime patrol near a railway spur. The gendarmes noted that the men carried no weapons and offered plausible explanations for their presence, claiming to be seasonal labourers travelling between farms. However, the patrol also confiscated a folded document containing several names and addresses, written in careful block letters. The list was brief, fewer than a dozen entries, and included occupations rather than explicit political affiliations. The gendarmes, uncertain how to interpret the find, released the men after recording their identities. The report emphasized that no overtly subversive material was discovered and that no further action was taken. It concluded with a recommendation that the incident be logged for reference but did not request follow-up. Such language was common, especially when local forces lacked the capacity or inclination to pursue ambiguous cases. When the report reached Clermont-Ferrand, it entered the general intake queue. The clerk reviewed the document as part of a daily batch that included dozens of similar notices. The handwriting was legible but unremarkable. The list of names did not correspond to any known political leaders or previously flagged individuals in the regional index. No symbols or slogans were present. According to standard procedure, the clerk assigned the report a classification associated with minor public order incidents rather than political security. This decision determined the file's trajectory. Instead of being routed to the political police section, where analysts cross-referenced names with national registries, the report was archived alongside routine gendarmerie logs. A carbon copy was sent to the prefecture for record-keeping, but no alert was issued. The original document, including the list of names, was placed in a folder that would likely not be reopened unless a related incident occurred. At the time, the misclassification did not stand out. The volume of paperwork was overwhelming, and guidance from Paris often lagged behind events. Circulars warning of clandestine groupings were phrased broadly and offered little practical instruction for distinguishing early resistance from ordinary disorder. Clerks were expected to exercise judgment within the limits of their training, and errors were rarely acknowledged unless they resulted in clear administrative failure. The clerk himself noted nothing unusual. His workday continued with the processing of additional files, many of which contained far more explicit references to political dissent, communist tracts, anti-German graffiti, and reports of radio listening violations demanded attention. Compared to these, a list of names without context seemed inconsequential. By the end of the week, the file had been absorbed into the archive. Beyond the walls of the prefectural building, conditions in the region were slowly deteriorating. Economic shortages deepened, and resentment toward both the occupiers and the Vichy authorities grew. Railways essential for German logistics became points of quiet contention. Workers delayed shipments, misrouted freight, or reported mechanical issues that were difficult to verify. These acts were isolated and rarely coordinated, but they reflected a shifting mood. Local officials struggled to reconcile official doctrine with daily realities. Vichy propaganda emphasized order, renewal, and national discipline. Yet the administrative system showed signs of strain. Instructions from above often conflicted with the practical limitations faced by gendarmes and clerks alike. The emphasis on maintaining appearances sometimes outweighed the pursuit of ambiguous threats. In this environment, small administrative decisions accumulated unnoticed. Files were closed, reports were shelved, and names were forgotten. The misfiled report from Haute-Loire joined hundreds of others that documented the early indistinct contours of opposition. At the time, it represented neither success nor failure, only the routine functioning of a system under pressure. As autumn approached, new directives arrived calling for stricter monitoring of rail corridors and rural transit routes. The volume of reports increased accordingly, further humbly taxing the archive. The clerk continued his work, aware of the growing complexity of the situation, but constrained by the same procedures that governed every document he handled. The earlier report remained where it had been placed, untouched and unremarked, as the administrative machinery moved forward without pause. By early autumn in 1941, the security situation in the unoccupied zone had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the assumptions guiding Vichy's internal policing. Official doctrine continued to emphasize centralized oversight, legal process, and the containment of dissent through surveillance rather than confrontation. In practice, however, the flow of information from the field suggested a pattern of low-level disruption that did not fit neatly into existing categories. Railway incidents multiplied across the massive central and adjoining regions. Delays attributed to equipment failure became more frequent. Cargo manifests showed discrepancies that could not be explained by clerical error alone. In several instances, shipments destined for northern depots arrived incomplete, while others failed to arrive at all. German liaison officers lodged formal complaints with prefectures, demanding explanations and corrective measures. Vichy officials, eager to avoid direct German intervention, issued instructions for tighter controls and more thorough reporting. The gendarmerie responded by increasing patrols near rail junctions and by questioning individuals found travelling without clear purpose. These actions generated a growing volume of reports, many of which described encounters similar in character to the one recorded in Haute-Loire weeks earlier. Men detained briefly, questioned, and released. Papers confiscated and later returned. Names noted without clear indication of affiliation. Each report, taken alone, appeared insignificant. At the regional archive in Clermont-Ferrand, the accumulation of such material created an administrative challenge. Clerks were required to process incoming documents rapidly to keep pace with demand. The distinction between political and non-political incidents became harder to maintain as activities overlapped. A suspected black market courier might also be transporting messages. A railway worker accused of negligence might be acting deliberately. Yet without explicit evidence, reclassification remained rare. The clerk responsible for intake continued to rely on formal criteria. Reports lacking ideological language or direct references to banned organizations were filed as routine matters. Supervisors, preoccupied with high-profile cases and external pressure from Paris, offered little guidance beyond adherence to procedure. The system favored caution in labeling incidents as political, as such designations carried implications for interdepartmental coordination and German notification. Meanwhile, prefectural authorities began to notice inconsistencies. Names appeared sporadically across different reports, but without centralized analysis, patterns went undetected. One surname recorded in a railway delay report surfaced again in a ration card investigation weeks later, filed under an unrelated category. Another individual questioned for violating curfew was later mentioned in connection with forged travel permits. These overlaps were incidental and did not trigger review. The misfiled Haute-Loire report remained a missed point of convergence. The list of names it contained corresponded loosely to several individuals who would later attract attention, but the absence of a political classification meant the document was excluded from comparative indexing. The archive's structure, designed for clarity, inadvertently obscured connections that fell between categories. In October 1941, German authorities intensified demands following acts of resistance in the occupied zone, including sabotage and assassinations. Though these events occurred outside Vichy's direct control, they influenced policy across France. The regime issued new circulars calling for vigilance against latent subversive networks, particularly those exploiting rural anonymity. Prefects were instructed to review recent incidents for signs of coordination. Implementation of these orders varied. Some regions established ad hoc review committees, while others relied on existing staff to conduct retrospective checks. In Clermont-Ferrand, limited personnel meant that only a selection of files deemed most relevant were reassessed. Priority was given to reports already classified as political, or those involving known activists. Routine gendarmerie logs remained largely untouched. As scrutiny increased, the gap between reported reality and administrative interpretation widened. Field officers expressed frustration at the lack of follow-up on ambiguous cases. Informal conversations between gendarmes and prefectural staff hinted at a sense that something was being overlooked, though no one could articulate precisely what. The absence of a clear adversary made action difficult. The clerk, for his part, became aware of the growing unease, but saw no direct reason to revisit earlier decisions. His role did not include analytical review, and reopening closed files without instruction was discouraged. The pressure to process new material left little time for reflection. Each day brought additional reports, each requiring classification and filing before the next batch arrived. In late November, a memorandum circulated noting that several railway disruptions shared common geographic features often occurring near minor junctions or rural sidings. The document suggested closer coordination between transport police and local gendarmerie, but stopped short of alleging organised resistance. It did not reference specific individuals or prior reports. The absence of explicit links reinforced existing practices. Without names or clear directives, the archive remained fragmented. Files accumulated in parallel, documenting what appeared to be isolated failures rather than components of a broader phenomenon. The administrative language used to describe incidents emphasized accident, error, or individual misconduct, aligning with the regime's preference for manageable explanations. As winter approached, resource constraints worsened. Fuel shortages, limited patrols, and communication delays became common. Reports arrived days or weeks after incidents occurred, reducing their perceived urgency. In this context, the earlier misclassification took on greater significance, not because it was recognized, but because the opportunity for corrective action narrowed. The system continued to function as designed, processing information efficiently but without synthesis. The gap between official assessments and conditions on the ground persisted, growing incrementally rather than dramatically. For the individuals whose names appeared intermittently across reports, this meant continued freedom of movement and the ability to operate without sustained scrutiny. By December 1941, the archive held a record of numerous small disruptions, none of which had been definitively linked. The clerk completed his workdays aware that the situation was evolving, but constrained by the same procedural boundaries that had governed his actions since the armistice. The misfiled report remained buried among routine documents, its potential relevance unrealized as the administrative system absorbed another seasons of quiet instability. The turn of the year brought with it a subtle shift in the way events were interpreted within the unoccupied zone. By January 1942, the cumulative effect of minor disruptions could no longer be entirely dismissed as coincidence. Although no single incident rose to the level of a crisis, the persistence of irregularities along transport routes and in rural districts began to challenge the assumption that order was being maintained through routine administration alone. Within the prefectural offices of Clermont-Ferrand, a limited internal review was initiated at the direction of a senior official concerned about the tone of recent communications from Paris. The review was not framed as an investigation, but as a reassessment of reporting practices. Clerks were instructed to flag recurring locations and repeated personal names, even when incidents appeared non-political. This guidance marked a departure from earlier emphasis on strict categorical separation. The clerk assigned to the regional archive encountered these instructions during a briefing that stressed discretion and efficiency. No formal retraining accompanied the change. Instead, staff were expected to apply judgment within existing workflows. The directive acknowledged, implicitly, that prior procedures might have overlooked emerging patterns. As the clerk resumed his work, he began to notice overlaps that had previously gone unremarked. A surname from a railway delay report appeared again in a file concerning unauthorized travel permits. Another name surfaced in a gendarmerie note about a missing shipment of agricultural equipment. Individually, these entries remained inconclusive, but their recurrence prompted quiet notation in the margins of intake logs. During this process, the clerk encountered the earlier Haute-Loire report while searching for related material requested by a supervisor. The file's contents were unchanged, but its context had shifted. The list of names, once seemingly incidental, now bore resemblance to other records that had accumulated over subsequent months. Several of the individuals listed had been mentioned elsewhere, though never in connection with one another. The clerk faced a procedural dilemma. Reclassifying a closed file required authorization, and the absence of explicit evidence of political activity made such a request uncertain. At the same time, the new guidance encouraged attentiveness to repetition rather than proof. The decision to act carried personal risk, as mislabeling a document could attract scrutiny from both superiors and external authorities. After consulting classification manuals and recent circulars, the clerk opted for a limited adjustment. He did not alter the original filing, but prepared a supplementary note drawing attention to name overlaps across multiple reports. This note was forwarded to a supervisor responsible for liaison with the prefecture's security section. The action was modest and framed as informational rather than accusatory. The response was restrained. The supervisor acknowledged receipt and requested additional examples if available. No immediate action followed. Nevertheless, the supplementary note initiated a process of informal cross-referencing that had not previously occurred. A small number of files were pulled for comparison, revealing a loose network of individuals connected by shared locations and occupations rather than overt ideology. The realization that these links had gone unnoticed for months underscored the limitations of existing doctrine. Official guidance still emphasized the identification of organized movements with clear leadership and propaganda. What emerged from the review did not fit this model. The individuals appeared to operate independently, yet their activities suggested coordination through familiarity and trust, rather than formal structure. As analysis progressed, the risks became more apparent. Several of the names were associated with rail infrastructure or supply chains critical to German operations. Others had access to communication routes that could facilitate information transfer. The absence of overt political markers had allowed them to function below the threshold of attention. For the clerk, the process became personal in an unexpected way. His earlier decision to classify the Haute-Loire report as routine now appeared consequential. While the misclassification had followed procedure, it had also contributed to a delay in recognizing a developing pattern. The awareness introduced a sense of responsibility that extended beyond clerical accuracy. Despite this, institutional caution prevailed. Senior officials hesitated to escalate findings without clear mandates. The possibility of German involvement loomed over any decision, as political files were subject to sharing under armistice terms. Misjudging the nature of the network could result in severe repercussions for those involved and for the administration itself. As winter deepened, the informal review continued at a measured pace. No arrests were ordered, and surveillance remained limited. The supplementary note and associated files circulated quietly among a small group of officials, marking the first tentative acknowledgement that routine classification had failed to capture the full reality of events. The clerk returned to his daily tasks with a heightened awareness of the implications of his work. Each report now carried potential significance beyond its immediate content. The archive, once a repository of isolated incidents, began to appear as a map of relationships waiting to be discerned. The operational problem had shifted from managing volume to interpreting meaning, a challenge for which the system was only partially prepared. By the early months of 1942, the limited reassessment underway in Clermont-Ferrand encountered resistance from within the administrative hierarchy. The informal nature of the cross-referencing effort, while initially tolerated, began to draw concern from senior officials wary of overstepping defined authority. Vichy's internal security apparatus was designed to operate through clear chains of command, and deviations from established procedures risked being interpreted as incompetence or insubordination. The supplementary notes circulated by the clerk and a small group of analysts remained deliberately cautious. Language was technical and non-committal, emphasizing correlation rather than causation. Even so, their implications were difficult to ignore. The repeated appearance of certain individuals across disparate reports suggested a continuity of activity that contradicted the prevailing assumption of isolated incidents. When these observations reached the prefectural security section, the response was measured but skeptical. Officials requested clarification on methodology and questioned whether the apparent overlaps might be the result of common surnames or occupational clustering rather than coordination. Rural regions, they noted, often produced repetitive names, particularly among railway and agricultural workers. Without direct evidence of intent, the findings were deemed inconclusive. At the same time, pressure from German authorities intensified. Requests for demonstrable action against sabotage and non-compliance increased, following incidents in the occupied zone. Though these events were geographically distant, the expectation that Vichy would prevent similar developments in the south placed additional strain on local administrations. Prefects were encouraged to demonstrate vigilance without provoking unrest or exposing administrative weaknesses. This dual pressure created a narrowing margin for interpretation. On one side lay the risk of ignoring a nascent resistance network. On the other, the danger of mischaracterizing routine disruptions as political subversion. The Misfiled Haute-Loire report, now partially integrated into the review, exemplified this tension. Its initial treatment as a minor incident was procedurally sound, yet its retrospective significance challenged the adequacy of established classifications. The clerk found his role increasingly constrained. Requests to revisit older files were met with delays or deflections. Supervisors emphasized the need to prioritize current reports, citing staffing shortages and external scrutiny. The informal review persisted, but its scope remained limited by institutional reluctance to formalize findings that lacked explicit proof. As spring approached, the consequences of earlier administrative decisions became more apparent. Several individuals identified through cross-referencing disappeared from routine records, suggesting either heightened caution on their part or movement beyond the region. Railway disruptions continued, though they became less predictable, complicating efforts to attribute responsibility. The absence of arrests or formal investigations allowed the network, whatever its precise nature, to adapt. Internal correspondence reflected growing unease. Memoranda acknowledged that existing surveillance methods might be insufficient to detect decentralized activity. However, proposals for reform were couched in abstract terms and deferred pending further guidance from Paris. The emphasis remained on maintaining administrative coherence rather than pursuing uncertain leads. The clerk's involvement, though limited, exposed him to the implications of systemic inertia. His earlier decision, made under routine conditions, now intersected with a broader pattern of missed opportunities. While no direct reprimand followed, the subtle withdrawal of support signalled institutional discomfort with the direction of the review. By late April 1942, the informal cross-referencing effort reached an impasse. Without authorization to expand its scope or access additional resources, it could proceed no further. The files were returned to their original categories, supplemented by marginal notes that would likely remain unread. The administrative system reasserted its preference for stability over speculation. The stakes, though unspoken, had reached their peak within the confines of bureaucratic process. The potential consequences of action or inaction were understood but not articulated. The The archive once again settled into routine, carrying within it the unresolved traces of a developing resistance chain, shaped as much by the oversight as by intent. By mid-1942, the administrative moment that had briefly opened within the Clermont-Ferrand prefecture closed without formal resolution. The informal reassessment effort, lacking authorization and external support, left little lasting imprint on institutional practice. Official procedures resumed their previous form, and the archive returned to its primary function as a repository rather than an analytical instrument. Events beyond the unoccupied zone soon overtook local concerns. German military demands increased following developments on the Eastern Front, and Vichy's margin of autonomy narrowed further. In November 1942, German forces occupied the southern zone, dissolving the legal distinction that had underpinned much of the earlier administrative caution. With the arrival of German security units, the nature of surveillance and repression changed abruptly. Under occupation, French administrative records were subjected to new scrutiny. Archives were examined selectively, often with little regard for their original classifications. Some files were seized, others ignored. The misfiled Haute-Loire report, long buried among routine gendarmerie logs, did not attract attention during these reviews. Its supplementary notes, cautious and understated, offered no immediate value to occupying authorities focused on identifying overt resistance leaders. By this stage, the individuals named in the original report had largely moved on. Some left the region, joining broader resistance formations that emerged more clearly after 1942. Others adapted to the new conditions, operating with greater compartmentalization. The absence of early centralized detection had allowed these networks to develop incrementally, shaped by local knowledge rather than formal organization. Within the prefecture, personnel changes followed the occupation. Some officials were dismissed, others reassigned. The clerk continued his work under altered supervision, processing documents in a system increasingly constrained by external control. The earlier episode faded into the background of daily routine, recalled only occasionally as an example of procedural ambiguity rather than failure. After the liberation, post-war reviews examined the conduct of Vichy institutions with a focus on collaboration and repression. Administrative oversights received less attention than overt actions. The misfiled report did not figure in official inquiries, nor was it cited in resistance histories that favoured dramatic acts over incremental developments. Its significance lay not in what it caused directly, but in what it revealed about the limits of bureaucratic perception. The archive itself survived the war largely intact. Decades later, historians examining regional records would note the scattered traces of early resistance activity, often fragmented across unrelated files. The Haute-Loire report, when rediscovered, appeared unremarkable on its own. Only in aggregate did such documents illustrate how decentralized opposition could evade systems designed to detect formal movements. The clerk's role remained undocumented beyond routine personnel files. He neither claimed credit nor faced censure. His actions reflected the constraints and ambiguities of a system operating under occupation and political compromise. The misclassification that once seemed inconsequential became, in hindsight, an example of how administrative routine could shape historical outcomes without intent. The story of the misfiled report is therefore not one of dramatic revelation, but of quiet process. It demonstrates how resistance could emerge not only through bold acts, but through the spaces left by their institutional limitation. In these spaces, individuals operated, adapted and connected, forming chains that were invisible until they no longer needed to be. For those interested in understanding how overlooked details and ordinary decisions contributed to the broader history of World War II, continued exploration of such archival traces offers insight into the subtle mechanics of occupation and resistance.